The room didn't erupt in applause. It fractured. A few claps, a few gasps, and then, clear as day, impossible to miss, boos cutting through the polished silence of one of the most exclusive nights in entertainment. Not a tabloid rumor, not a shaky phone clip, but a live broadcast moment that made people at home sit up and say, "Wait, did that really just happen?" Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because this wasn't a late-night talk show. This wasn't a protest. This was the Grammys. So here's the question no one wants to ask out loud. How did two of the most polarizing figures on the planet end up walking into a room that didn't want them there? And more importantly, why did the reaction feel so personal? At first, the moment was almost surreal. Cameras cut. Smiles froze. A split second of confusion hung in the air like static. You could see it on faces in the crowd. The hesitation, the side-eye, the subtle calculation of whether to clap or stay very still. Then the sound grew louder, not unanimous, but unmistakable. Booing, heckling, and a kind of collective discomfort that no publicist can spin away. This wasn't supposed to happen. Award shows are choreographed ecosystems. Guest lists are vetted. Seating is intentional. Reactions are managed. When someone walks into that room, the assumption is simple. They belong there. Or at least everyone has agreed to pretend they do. So when that agreement breaks, it tells you something has shifted. Now, let's be clear about one thing right up front. Moments like this don't come out of nowhere. Crowds don't turn on a dime without history behind them. And this reaction, whether you see it as cruelty, backlash, or long overdue honesty, felt loaded with context. Years of interviews. Years of headlines. Years of carefully crafted narratives colliding with public fatigue in real time. Ask yourself this. When was the last time a global awards audience reacted this emotionally to someone who wasn't even nominated? Exactly. That's what made the moment sting. It wasn't about music, or film, or art. It was about presence, about perception, about whether the story the public had been sold for years was still working, or whether the room had finally decided it was done playing along. And here's where it gets even more uncomfortable. Because the boos weren't just noise, they were a message. A crack in the polished image, a sign that something once protected by sympathy, curiosity, and endless coverage might have crossed an invisible line. And once that line is crossed, there's no PR strategy powerful enough to erase the sound of a crowd turning against you. But the real mystery isn't the reaction, it's the invitation. Who thought this was a good idea? Who signed off on this appearance? And did anyone, anywhere, consider how the room might actually respond once the cameras started rolling? Because according to whispers that surfaced afterward, there were warning signs long before they ever stepped inside. Awkward pre-show conversations, visible tension backstage, industry figures who suddenly found reasons to be somewhere else, little signals that, in hindsight, feel impossible to ignore. So when the boos finally broke through the applause, maybe the shock wasn't that it happened. Maybe the shock was that it took this long. And once you understand how they ended up in that room, who opened the door, and why, the moment stops looking random and starts looking inevitable. The cameras showed smiles, but the room told a different story. Because if you looked closely, really closely, you could see it unfolding in real time. The delayed clapping, the stiff posture, the way some people stared straight ahead, refusing to engage at all. Others glanced sideways, not at the stage, but at each other, silently asking the same question everyone at home was thinking. Is this really happening? Award shows thrive on illusion. They sell unity, celebration, mutual admiration. Even when scandals bubble under the surface, the unspoken rule is simple. Keep it together until the lights go out. That's why what happened next felt so jarring. The sound wasn't overwhelming, but it was sharp, cutting, unmistakable. A disruption that no director could fully mask with reaction shots or quick edits. And here's the thing most viewers didn't realize in the moment. This wasn't just about sound. It was about energy. People in that room knew something was off before the boos even registered. You could sense it in the air. The tension wasn't loud at first. It was heavy, thick, like everyone was waiting to see which way the crowd would lean. Applause? Silence? Polite indifference? Instead, the room fractured. Some clapped out of reflex, some stayed frozen, and some, enough to be heard, made their displeasure clear. That mix is what made the moment so uncomfortable. It wasn't a unified protest. It was something messier, something rawer, a sign that the audience itself was divided, unsure whether to play along anymore. Ask yourself this: when was the last time you saw that happen at a ceremony this controlled? Exactly. Behind the scenes, events like this are rehearsed down to the second. Walk-ins are timed. Camera angles are planned. Seating arrangements are designed to minimize surprises. So when a reaction slips through the cracks, it usually means one of two things. Either no one anticipated it, or someone did, and underestimated how strong it would be. The expressions on nearby faces told their own story. Tight smiles that didn't reach the eyes. A few people leaning back in their seats, arms crossed. Others, suddenly very interested in their phones. These weren't random attendees. These were insiders, people who understand how this game is played. And their body language suggested discomfort, not solidarity. That's when the questions really start to pile up. Was this a miscalculation? A gamble that backfired? Or a sign that the goodwill they once enjoyed has quietly evaporated? Because here's the contradiction that's hard to ignore. For years, the narrative leaned heavily on being outsiders, on rejection, on mistreatment. And yet, here they were, front and center at one of the most elite industry gatherings on the planet. Not sidelined, not ignored, but visible. Visibility, however, cuts both ways. The more people see you, the more they judge you. The more you speak, the more audiences decide whether they're still listening. And in that room, on that night, it felt like a verdict was forming in real time. Some viewers later said the boos were exaggerated. Others said they were overdue. But even critics who disagreed on the interpretation agreed on one thing: the moment landed differently than any appearance before it. It didn't spark sympathy. It sparked debate. And debate is dangerous territory when your brand relies on moral clarity. What made it worse was what didn't happen. No standing ovation. No wave of supportive cheers to drown out the negativity. No immediate course correction. Just an awkward transition and a room trying to move on as if nothing unusual had occurred. But something had. And everyone could feel it. Because once an audience breaks the spell, once they stop playing their assigned role, the illusion cracks. And cracks have a way of spreading. Which brings us to the question that loomed larger than the boos themselves. Who decided they should be there in the first place? Because invitations like this don't just appear. And the answer to that question might explain why the room reacted the way it did, and why the fallout was only just beginning. Because invitations like this don't happen by accident. That's the part most people miss. Major award shows aren't open houses. Every seat is accounted for. Every appearance is weighed for optics, alliances, and risk. Which means someone, somewhere, thought this was a smart move. Someone believed the room would respond with applause, or at least polite silence. Someone assumed the story was still working. And that assumption may have been the biggest mistake of the night. Let's slow this down and ask the uncomfortable question. Why were they there? They weren't nominees. They weren't presenters. They weren't tied to a major performance, so the appearance wasn't about music. It wasn't about honoring art. It was about presence, about relevance, about reminding the world and perhaps the industry itself that they still mattered in elite spaces. But here's the irony no one wanted to confront. For years, the message was about stepping away, about rejecting the spotlight, about choosing a quieter, more private life. And yet, again and again, the biggest moments seem to happen under the brightest lights. Interviews, specials, red carpets, high-profile events. So when they walked into that room, it wasn't just a couple entering an awards show. It was a contradiction, walking in on itself. People in the industry notice those things. Quietly, patiently. They don't boo right away. They watch. They listen. They keep score. And when the gap between words and actions grows too wide, the mood shifts. That's why the reaction felt less like shock and more like release. According to multiple accounts that surfaced afterward, the discomfort started long before the cameras rolled. Backstage conversations reportedly went cold. Familiar faces suddenly became distant. There were fewer smiles, fewer warm greetings, more polite nods that said, "I see you," without saying, "I support you." And that matters, because in rooms like this, support isn't loud. It's subtle. It's who stands next to you, who laughs at your jokes, who makes space at their table. And on that night, the space felt limited. Ask yourself this: if the room truly welcomed them, would the boos have cut through it all? Or would they have been swallowed by applause the way controversy usually is? This is where the story takes a sharper turn, because the boos weren't just about personalities, they were about fatigue, about a growing sense that the narrative had stopped evolving, that every appearance felt like a repeat of the same themes, the same grievances, the same framing. Audiences change, rooms change, and what once felt brave can start to feel performative when it's repeated without reflection. That's not cruelty, that's cultural shift. And cultural shifts are brutal because they don't announce themselves politely. They show up as awkward silences, as withheld applause, as moments where people stop pretending. So when the heckling broke through, it wasn't just noise. It was a signal that the unspoken agreement, the one that says we'll clap because it's easier, had finally broken. But here's where things get even more complicated. Because some people in that room weren't just uncomfortable. They were angry. Angry at the perception of entitlement. Angry at being used as backdrops in someone else's story. Angry that a night meant to celebrate artistry had become another chapter in a long-running personal saga. And once anger enters the room, politeness disappears fast, which raises a chilling possibility. What if the invitation wasn't about honoring them at all? What if it was a test? A temperature check, a gamble to see whether the public and the industry would still play along. If that's true, the answer came back loud and clear, and the consequences of that answer wouldn't stay confined to one night. Because what happened after the show, away from the cameras and polished speeches, would reshape how future doors quietly opened or stayed firmly shut. By the end of the night, the boos had faded, but the echo didn't. That's the part that lingers long after the lights dim and the red carpet is rolled away. Because moments like this don't live in the broadcast. They live in memory, in group chats, in quiet industry conversations, in the subtle recalculations that happen when people decide who still belongs in which rooms. Think back to the opening moment. The shock, the confusion, the sound that shouldn't have been there. Now look at it again with everything we've unpacked, the history, the contradictions, the fatigue, the quiet resentment that had been building appearance after appearance, interview after interview. Suddenly, the boos stop feeling random. They start feeling like a verdict. This wasn't about one night or one crowd. It was about a relationship between public figures and an audience that may have reached its limit. Sympathy can stretch far, but it isn't infinite. And when people feel they've been asked to react the same way for too long, they eventually stop reacting at all. Or worse, they push back. That's what made this moment so unsettling. Not the noise itself, but what it revealed. A crack in the narrative armor, a sign that control over the story might be slipping. And here's the irony that cuts deepest. For years, the argument was that the world wouldn't let them move on, that the attention was unwanted, that the spotlight was imposed. And yet, standing in that room, under those lights, the question flipped completely. If the spotlight is the problem, why keep stepping into it? That question hung in the air far longer than the boos did, because it forces a reckoning not just for them, but for everyone watching. At what point does telling your story turn into repeating it? At what point does visibility stop being validation and start becoming exposure? The audience at home wasn't just watching an awkward moment, they were watching a power shift. A subtle one, but a meaningful one. The kind that doesn't explode overnight, but quietly changes the tone of future coverage, future invitations, future reactions. And make no mistake, rooms like that they remember who makes things uncomfortable. They remember who brings tension instead of celebration. They remember who turns a shared stage into a personal referendum. That doesn't mean exile. It doesn't mean disappearance. But it does mean recalibration. Fewer automatic invites. More hesitation, more maybe next time. And that might be the hardest part to accept. Because boos can be dismissed. They can be blamed on bad acoustics, rogue attendees, unfair editing. But indifference? Distance? Doors that don't open as easily as they once did? Those are much harder to fight. So when people ask whether the reaction was deserved, they might be missing the point. The real question is simpler and far more uncomfortable. What does it mean when even the most controlled rooms stop pretending? Was this a one-night backlash? Or the first visible crack in a carefully managed image? That's for you to decide. And I want to hear what you think. Were the boos crossing a line? Or were they the room finally saying what it had been holding back for years? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If you're seeing the shift too, hit like, subscribe, and stay with us. Because stories like this don't end on one stage.